Hey everybody, welcome back to Phantom Astronaut. Today we're going to be doing a trailer react to 28 Weeks Later by Danny Boyle. So no pre-watch, let's get right on into it. I remember seeing the original 28 Days Later when it came out in theaters, and the thing that really stood out to me about it, besides how the zombies sort of moved, fast zombies, as opposed to more of like the Romero kind of staggering zombies, was the way it was produced. It was made by a production team using a Canon XL1 camera. This was a digital video camera that was available to the consumer marketplace. It only cost a few $1,000s. It had interchangeable lenses. It was really the precursor to a lot of what we would see with DSLRs and popular cameras that we have today that use memory cards, but it used like little tapes, DV tapes, digital video tapes. And then they transferred that to film. They had a lot of issues with that process, but it allowed them to shoot some interesting apocalyptic scenes around London that would not have been achievable using one or two cameras. So it was actually kind of a cool thing. Let's take a look. I love the film. Love Danny Boyle. Okay. So right off the bat, with the Teletubbies, if you don't know what Teletubbies are, then, man, you are very lucky, because Teletubbies were omnipresent for a while in media in the very late 90s, very early 2000s. They had a window of time where they were very popular, and the Teletubbies were sort of ubiquitous in the same way that, like, I've got a niece, and she's really into Bluey. She used to be into Peppa Pig, so Teletubbies were sort of that. But in their own way, they are unsettling, alien kind of things. There's some cool folklore and conspiracy stuff around, I think, Tinky Winky and the LGBTQ community. There were a lot of conspiracy theories about, Teletubbies were like melting kids' brains and stuff like that. So kind of interesting that this is rooting this trailer, at least this section of the trailer, in a time and place. This feels like maybe this is before the original film, almost like a prequel. Then you've got kids. Obviously, Frantic Mom. Frantic Mom is looking like she's telling them all to stay put. That can't end well, right? Okay, it began. So, yes, this seems to be some kind of a prequel. At least this section of it. Okay. Oof, brutal. Love it. All right, so this seems like it might also be in the before time, because in the original 28 Days Later, there's a scene where Jim, played by Cillian Murphy, goes into a church and he sees the, I don't know what they call the Church of England version of it, vicar, maybe? And he sees the vicar, the priest, whatever you want to call him, sort of like spreading out, staggering around, and then he finds that all of the parishioners are sleeping in the church, and they all start to wake up. They've all been infected by this rage virus. So that's one thing that we haven't talked about, is that in the 28 Days Later series, the zombification happens through a virus. It is a rage virus, and it's not necessarily just like an emotional virus. A little bit, I think, attached to rabies, I think, is what they were trying to go for with that. And if you watch the original, it begins with a group of environmental activists freeing a lab full of monkeys that have been being tested on. If you've ever gone back and watched something like Hot Zone, great series based on an equally great film about Ebola and the Ebola potential outbreak and how those were thwarted here in the United States. Really, really cool people who work in epidemiology. Used to have a good friend whose father worked at the CDC in Atlanta, and I was fortunate enough to stay at their house once. Very interesting people, very, very cool people who are always on the front lines of this kind of stuff. So in Danny Boyle's universe of 28 Days Later, Danny Boyle and Alex Garland's universe, what you end up with is this hyper version of rabies that spreads very quickly and sort of destroys the nervous system. And it is very much a physical ailment. It doesn't necessarily reanimate the dead. So, being at the time we were in sort of the middle of things like the second Iraq War, Afghanistan, sort of post 9/11 universe. There was a lot of propaganda that was floating around. There was a lot of confusion that was happening in that time period, and I think they were trying to latch onto that about how an idea, a paranoia, can spread. This is when the surveillance state started to take over in places like the UK and, by extension, a little bit later, the United States. We were doing it slightly differently, even though we have probably the same amount of cameras or more than the UK, especially London in major cities. We sort of started monitoring mobile devices. And there was this idea that this social contagion of paranoia can spread to people. And so now that we actually have gone through a major pandemic that we've all lived contemporaneously with COVID, it'll be interesting to see how revisiting some of these earlier scenes in 28 days later, grafted onto 28 years later, will try to close that circle. I'm wondering if the way that they're conceiving of this is to sort of show through lines and continuations in the subtext between what was happening culturally at that time versus what is happening nowadays, when we have many, many more vectors for people to constantly be outraged and for that outrage to spread and feel like a contagion of sorts in the paradigm of having lived through a pandemic. So going to definitely be an interesting commentary when this comes out.
Mm-hmm.
28 weeks later, I wasn't super in love with that. I saw it on TV. It wasn't something that I really dug into, even though I liked the cast. Cast was excellent. See, now this is interesting. This looks like we have this reversion to an agrarian society. And this is largely what would happen if you ended up with a contagion or something that led to a societal collapse. The first things that you would lose would be manufacturing. You would lose logistics. You would lose the ability to produce and distribute mass goods. So that would interrupt food supplies. That would interrupt really anything that you think that you need from a store that could be manufactured and assembled. So you go back to more of a handcrafted kind of a universe. You would end up in a place where, you know, these older farming things, smithing, that sort of thing, hunting, gathering, even though it looks like there still are some of the trappings of society, these are things that would outlive the zombie apocalypse. These are probably going to be the things that survive, or, you know, heavy duty clothing and maybe older farm equipment or equipment that's easier to maintain mechanically. You might end up having cars in the first 28 days later. There was a big scene where they were afraid to go get gas, and they really, really, really needed petrol, gasoline, to be able to continue their journey. So this is an extrapolation of that. And it's kind of cool to see it happen. I know Robert Kirkman and The Walking Dead and all this has already explored these themes, so maybe this is going to be a slightly different kind of take on that. This is kind of cool too. So this disheveled sort of Christ iconography also looks a little bit like an effigy, which reminds me of The Wicker Man, which brings me to folk horror. And folk horror is a genre that I really, really enjoy because it essentially examines the fear that happens in the liminal space between what we consider to be modern Western civilized society and rural societies. And this idea, this concept really worked its way in a couple of hundred years ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, into the psyche of a lot of European and European ancestry people, because there was a divide between the Christianized world after Constantine brought together all of the Christian mythology into the Roman Empire, made it the state religion. Rome never actually fell. Rome just sort of morphed over time into different things, and it really continues to this day institutionally in what you see with the Vatican and their influence. So all throughout medieval Europe, these different nations that had started to pop up, which now have modern analogs to what they once were, really looked up to the Vatican and Rome as their authority. They would ask Rome if they were allowed to wage war. They would ask Rome for rights in commerce, all kinds of different things. So really, Rome controlled quite a lot of Europe and how Europe was structured. Now, that's when you start to get into the idea of folk horror, because folk horror, as Christianity was rolling across Europe, what you would see is you would see these local folk traditions sort of getting caught in that wave. And sometimes local deities or mythologies would be canonized into sainthood, and they would be brought into the Catholic paradigm. Other times they would try to be really crushed and stamped out. And that's when a lot of things went underground. And the idea that these old gods, these entities, these energies will somehow have a resurgence and come back for Christianity, this, sort of revenge from the fringes, places where you're not supposed to go because these non-Christian entities still hold some kind of sacred power, this pagan animist kind of power. That's really where folk horror lives. And when you see something like this, it kind of is cool to me, because maybe what they're trying to say is that within the confines of England, which is a very Christian nation, not perhaps in terms of enforcement or theology, like theocracy, but culturally there's a lot of Christianity there. They're tied to things like the Crusades and the Church of England. Right now, King Charles is the head of their version of Christianity. Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War, again, big theocrat. So there's this constant push and pull of Christianity in the UK. And really, when you think about things like St. Patrick chasing the snakes out of Ireland during England's colonization, that's really a metaphor for the defeat of paganism. So now in the modern era, when you have a UK that is largely secular, what you're seeing in this post-apocalyptic world is a maybe return, almost reframing Christianity as a pagan folklore kind of religion. So the folk horror itself may be coming from a return to Christianity in a cult-like atmosphere. So that's kind of a cool theme that I hope they explore. Yeah, of course, there's a lot more religious iconography. Yeah. See, it says roles in our community. So you have farming, you have hunting. I'm guessing maybe that's gathering. Again, in a post-apocalyptic society, you would also have things like smithing. So this seems like maybe there's an outsider that's being brought in to this community. In the first 28 Days Later, Christopher Eccleston, who plays the military commander, the leader of that, the leader of that squad, whatever you want to call them, he's willing to make terrible sacrifices, morally speaking, the way he's going to victimize the girls in that film, to maintain what he considers to be modernity and civilization. So if this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the series of what will people do to maintain order in the face of change, it seems like maybe this is coming from another direction. It feels like maybe there's going to be outsiders coming into this community, and they're going to be confronted with what is perhaps an agrarian religious cult that has grown up in the fertile soil of the zombie apocalypse. A more destroyed infrastructure. Yeah, see, it's interesting because you see a mashup of things like barbed wire, things that would survive the apocalypse, at least for a time. I'm sure barbed wire, especially in a salty environment like that, would rust over, a period. But you're starting to also see iron. You're starting to also see arrows. You're starting to also see these sort of medieval weapons, things that you would probably see from the 16th, 17th, 18th century that really, really got diminished in the like the 1860s all the way up to the modern era, creating a resurgence, whether that be for protection or for hunting or for whatever else. There you go, bows and arrows. Mm-hmm. So, Academy Award winner Danny Boyle. Just as a side note, Danny Boyle won the Academy Award for Slumdog Millionaire. Great film. Danny Boyle is a really, really great director. I admire him a lot. I remember the first Danny Boyle film that I saw was probably Trainspotting. Saw that in the theater when I was a teenager. And just really, really life-changing the way he textured that. The sequel was also a great revisiting of that. Just such a great filmmaker. Sunshine, if you haven't checked that one out, it's another great Danny Boyle film. A lot of action stuff. Again, more Christian iconography. Alex Garland's another interesting guy. His career has really been great. I love Annihilation. Civil War was a great meditation on what it means for society to collapse. I think that he is really interested in how society is structured. He sees things in terms of systems and this conflict between systems and human nature. So I'll always love his perspective. All right, that's interesting. So it looks like you have like a leather tanner, kind of a leather face kind of a thing, creating this mask. And maybe this is part of the cult rituals. Maybe this is something that has sprung up almost like a cargo cult in the universe of this film where, I don't even know. Maybe this is some part of some kind of a ritualized remembrance of the times past. Let's talk a little bit about Norse mythology. I know this seems like a sidetrack, but if you look at what we know of like the Norse Edda, all that Norse mythology, all that interesting stuff that they've made Marvel movies and things about, all of that existed really in a post-Christian context. So it was written as a historical document. It was written in Latin. It was written and Norse and different kinds of translations, really in the context of trying to preserve some history in the face of Christianity rolling over their traditions, and Old English and all that. So let's take a little sidetrack into Norse mythology really quick. And if you think about the Edda, which is where we get all these great Norse stories, everything that they made the Marvel movies out of really comes from that. That's a post-Christian document. That's a document that was created in a way to try to preserve some of this folklore and history in a written way, in a way that could be perpetuated after Christian colonization. So looking at something like this, maybe this is a way for this particular cult to remember the times before. I'm not even sure if there are any zombies. I haven't seen any zombies in this so far. Mm-hmm. So it seems like it's switching back and forth between time periods. A lot of jump scare stuff looks like is about to happen. Yeah, there you go. Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, ritualistic. This whole thing seems to be about myth making, how we look at the past, how we contextualize the past. Mm-hmm. See, now that's kind of interesting. This looks like it's a Romero-style zombie, like a reanimated corpse of some kind, rising up, coming to life, and maybe it's going to take some revenge. I'm a little skeptical of that. Having seen the mask on that one figure from earlier, what I'm thinking this is, I think this may actually be an exercise in taxidermy. I think this may be a kind of a scarecrow. I think this may be something that they have preserved and are perhaps puppeting as a means of control and myth making. If you ever saw The Village from M. Night Shyamalan, that is another exercise in that kind of myth making where you have a mythological force used to maintain order and control. This may be a physical object that they've created to encourage perpetuation of that folklore. Again, I'm seeing a lot of guns and I'm seeing a lot of bows and arrows. The way that this cinematic universe they have going on here is structured, we don't really know what's going on outside the UK. I mean, at the end of 28 Weeks Later, we saw that I think there was something happening on mainland Europe, but we don't really know. So it could be a clash of people from the more modern outside world coming back into the UK, which has now become this sort of agrarian, deeply, deeply, strangely religious society. I'm not really sure. Maybe it's flashbacks. We'll see. And here we are, 28 years later. There's a little bit left in the timeline. Maybe there's something to see at the end of it. No, doesn't look like it. All right, well, that was 28 years later, Trailer React. Thank you all for joining me. If you're interested in the film, write a comment. Tell me what you thought of the trailer. Tell me what you thought about any of the folk horror that we've talked about, or zombies, Romero, that whole thing. One thing that we didn't really unpack is where this sits within the zombie canon, and the fact that you have your old style Romero staggering zombies, sort of this fear of the dead kind of a thing that really springs up from zombies that were more about like mind control, coming out of like Haitian voodoo and all that sort of stuff. And where does that lead us in placing this? Because it really set the pace for what we think of as zombies, especially in the middle 2000s to current day. This kind of predated the reboot, the Zack Snyder reboot of Dawn of the Dead. It set the pace for what we call fast zombies. And really, we have to look at all these things through the lens of like, what do they mean for us in society? What is the filmmaker trying to tell us with this particular creature or set of creatures? So I'm excited to see it. If you're excited too, let me know. Make sure to like, follow, subscribe. It's the only way that the algorithm really pushes my content. If you're looking for other ways to support the channel, check out the Patreon, other links in the description. And I have been Phantom Astronaut, and I will see you out there.